she whispered, "You're impossible." I smiled and said, "Then try me." The first time I noticed her, it wasn't in a way most people would call attention-grabbing. I was leaning against the edge of the classroom desk, pretending to be lost in my notebook, but my eyes kept drifting toward her. She moved with a quiet confidence, each step measured, graceful, almost like she was gliding over the worn linoleum floors. There was an elegance in her posture, in the way she held her shoulders back yet allowed a softness around her eyes. I didn't know her name yet, but her presence made the air feel heavier, warmer somehow, as though she carried her own little orbit that I was suddenly caught in. She noticed me, of course. Everyone notices someone who lingers a bit too long, but there was something in the way she looked at me that was different. It wasn't annoyance, not exactly. It was more calculating, amused, a little daring. When I finally caught her gaze, she raised a single brow, and it felt like she had just issued a challenge. "Impossible," she whispered, almost under her breath, as she adjusted a stack of papers near my desk. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of authority, of someone who was used to being listened to. I felt a strange pull, my chest tightened, my pulse ticked a little faster, and without thinking, I replied, almost daringly, "Then try me." There was a brief pause. Her eyes widened just the slightest fraction, then a smirk played at the corner of her lips. She walked past me, but not before her hand brushed the edge of my notebook. A fleeting touch, yet enough to send a shiver down my spine, a warmth that lingered longer than it should have. I pretended to focus on my notes, scribbling lines that were only half there. But every time I looked up, she was there in my line of sight, collecting papers, moving with that same effortless poise. I could tell she was older than me, confident, experienced, and yet, there was a subtle vulnerability in her that I couldn't place. Maybe it was the way her eyes softened when she smiled at a student who stumbled over a question, or the faint trace of fatigue around her temples that hinted she carried more than just the school's curriculum on her shoulders. By the end of the class, I realized something. I didn't just find her attractive, that would have been too simple, too superficial. I was intrigued in a way that made my chest tighten and my thoughts scatter. There was a spark, a silent tension between us that neither of us fully acknowledged but that both of us felt. Her "impossible" remark wasn't a dismissal, it was a dare. And somehow, I wanted to rise to it, even if I didn't entirely understand why. As I packed my things, I caught her glance one last time. There was a flicker in her eyes, curiosity, maybe even a trace of amusement, and it mirrored the feeling that had been building in me all class. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but for me, it was electric. And in that moment I knew this wasn't going to be ordinary. Something was starting, something quiet but undeniable, a tension that promised to stretch across days, weeks, maybe even months. And I was ready to see just how far it could go. The next few days after that first exchange were unusual. It wasn't that we spoke openly, far from it. In class, we maintained the veneer of propriety. I answered questions, she taught lessons, and yet, every interaction carried an invisible current that made ordinary moments feel charged. I began to notice the subtle ways she reacted around me. The way her fingers lingered on the edge of a book as she handed it to me, the slight pause before she corrected me, almost as if she was savoring the moment. One afternoon, the classroom emptied faster than usual, leaving only us behind. I lingered by the back row, pretending to rearrange my notes, watching her as she sorted through papers at her desk. She noticed me, of course. There was that familiar spark in her eyes, curiosity mixed with exasperation. And then, quietly, without a word, she made the first move. She challenged me. "You really are impossible," she said, straightening a stack of graded assignments. Her tone was calm, yet the words carried a playful sting. I looked up, smiled, and shrugged. "Maybe I just like a challenge." Her eyes flicked toward me, a tiny smile tugging at her lips, and she leaned over the desk, ostensibly to pick up a misplaced pen. Her hair brushed against my arm, the sensation so brief yet so distinct that my pulse jumped. The warmth of her presence lingered even after she pulled back. I could feel her awareness of me in that small space, a subtle playfulness that made every movement feel deliberate. Over the next hour, our interactions became a delicate dance. She asked me questions that weren't strictly necessary, ones that probed my reasoning, my opinions, the way I thought. I answered carefully, purposefully giving her a glimpse of my mind without fully revealing my intentions. Every time our hands accidentally brushed as we reached for the same textbook, a shiver ran through me. Every time our eyes met, there was that same unspoken acknowledgement, a silent game, a teasing challenge neither of us could fully ignore. It wasn't just the physical closeness that was intoxicating. It was the way she moved, the faint warmth in her voice when she corrected me, the subtle shifts in her posture when she leaned closer to hear my answer. I found myself observing the curve of her smile, the tilt of her head, the way her eyes softened when she allowed herself a small laugh at my mischievous remarks. And yet, beneath the teasing, there was a quiet restraint. She never overstepped the line, never allowed the tension to fully manifest. But it was there, undeniable, simmering in the spaces between words, in the brush of fingertips, in the lingering looks that seemed to stretch just a second too long. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of the day, we both knew that this was only the beginning. The playful challenges had begun to shape something more, a delicate, simmering connection that neither of us could ignore. The thrill wasn't just in the game itself. It was in the possibility of what could come if either of us dared to step closer, if either of us allowed the tension to grow into something more. And I wanted to. The teasing and playful challenges between us continued, but somewhere along the way, I began to notice her differently. Not just as a teacher or a figure of authority, but as someone who carried layers I hadn't expected. It was a quiet afternoon, sunlight slanting through the tall classroom windows, dust motes dancing lazily in the golden light. Most students had left, leaving only the faint echo of footsteps and the rustle of papers. She was at her desk, leaning over a stack of assignments, the lines of concentration softening her usual composed demeanor. I approached, ostensibly to ask a question about the lesson, but really, I wanted to observe her. There was something subtly fragile in the way she exhaled after correcting a particularly messy essay, a hint of fatigue that didn't belong to her otherwise controlled posture. Her hair had loosened from its usual neat bun, falling softly around her shoulders, brushing the side of her face. In that quiet moment, I saw her not as an authority figure, but as a woman, graceful, human, quietly vulnerable. "You've been pushing yourself too hard," I said gently, trying not to sound too forward. She looked up, startled slightly, and for a brief second, her carefully composed mask faltered. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, but there was a flicker in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement that she wasn't entirely fine. I moved a little closer, pretending to look at the assignment in front of me, but our shoulders brushed, and I felt the warmth of her presence more acutely than I expected. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned slightly toward me, as if allowing the closeness, even if she wasn't consciously aware of it. There was a tension in the air, not the playful teasing from before, but something deeper, more intimate. For a moment neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint scratching of her pen on paper, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the subtle hum of the heating system in the classroom. I noticed the faintest crease of worry in her brow, and the way her lips parted slightly when she exhaled. I realized I was drawn not only to her beauty but to her humanity, the quiet struggles she carried, the parts of herself she didn't show to anyone else. I dared a small gesture, brushing my fingers against the edge of the assignment she was holding. It was innocent enough to be unnoticed by anyone else, but the effect was immediate. She looked at me, her eyes widening fractionally, a warmth spreading across her cheeks. It was subtle, but electric, a wordless acknowledgement that something unspoken existed between us. And in that moment, I understood that our connection had moved beyond playful teasing. It had become something deeper, an unspoken understanding of each other's inner worlds. She had glimpsed my curiosity, my sincerity, and I had glimpsed her vulnerability, the quiet strength hidden beneath her polished exterior. We parted that day with a lingering glance, both of us aware that something had shifted. The attraction, the playful tension, had grown into a fragile intimacy, one that neither of us could name yet, but both of us could feel. And I realized, with a mix of excitement and apprehension, that I wanted to know every layer of her, every hidden depth, and perhaps, in time, allow her to see every part of me in return. The days that followed our quiet, emotional glimpses were filled with an almost unbearable tension. It was subtle, insidious, the kind of longing that hung in the air, thick enough to make ordinary interactions feel electrified. I noticed it in every detail: the way her eyes lingered a second longer than necessary when I answered a question, the faint shift of her posture whenever I approached her desk, the soft sigh that escaped her lips when a class discussion got particularly heated. It was a rainy afternoon when it reached a tipping point. The sky had opened into a steady drizzle, soft fingers of rain tapping rhythmically against the windows. Most students had left, but I lingered, pretending to organize my notes. She emerged from the back of the classroom, holding an umbrella, and paused when she saw me still there. "Need a ride?" she asked, her voice calm, yet carrying a subtle warmth that made my chest tighten. I hesitated, caught off guard. Something in her eyes told me this wasn't a simple courtesy. There was an unspoken understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the tension that neither of us dared name aloud. I nodded, and we stepped into the drizzle together, the umbrella barely covering us both. The closeness made my heart race, the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the fresh, earthy smell of rain. Our shoulders brushed, and I felt a shiver travel down my spine, subtle but electric. The walk was quiet, punctuated only by the soft patter of rain. Every glance, every accidental touch, carried weight. When the umbrella shifted, our hands brushed, fingers just barely grazing each other. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, see the way her eyelashes caught droplets of rain, the subtle parting of her lips as she exhaled. I wanted to speak, to break the silence with something more than words, but I didn't. The restraint itself felt intimate, a shared secret between us. Inside, I battled conflicting emotions. Part of me was thrilled, exhilarated by the proximity, and the almost forbidden tension. Another part, the rational, careful part, reminded me that boundaries existed, that she was older, that this was a teacher-student relationship. But even as I tried to push the thought away, I couldn't ignore the flutter of longing, the pull that drew me closer to her with every step. I sensed she felt it too. There were subtle tells, the quickening of her pulse in the small space between us, the slight hesitation in her movements, the warmth in her eyes that betrayed a desire she didn't voice. She was trying to maintain control, to preserve the propriety of our relationship, yet every shared glance, every brush of skin, whispered otherwise. By the time we reached the school gate, either of us had spoken much. But as she handed me the umbrella and our fingers lingered just a heartbeat too long, I realized something profound. The attraction had shifted into something more. It was no longer playful curiosity or fleeting admiration. It was longing, quiet yet powerful, and it existed in the spaces between words, in the unspoken confessions that neither of us dared voice. And yet, even in that longing, there was respect, a mutual acknowledgement of boundaries. That delicate balance, the pull of desire restrained by propriety, made every touch, every glance, every pause feel infinitely more potent. And I knew, deep down, that we were both teetering on the edge of something transformative, something neither of us could fully define but both of us were irrevocably drawn toward. The tension between us had grown almost unbearable. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was in the quiet moments, the pauses between words, the way our presence seemed to fill the space around each other. That evening, the classroom was empty, the sun lowering into a soft, golden haze that filtered through the tall windows. The desks cast long shadows, stretching across the floor like delicate fingers, and the familiar smell of chalk and polished wood seemed sharper somehow, more intimate. I found myself lingering near her desk, pretending to organize my notes, but really just watching her. She moved with the same quiet grace, sorting papers with careful precision, yet there was a softness in her that hadn't been there before. She caught my gaze and held it, just for a moment longer than usual. That look was a mixture of amusement, curiosity, and something else I couldn't name. I realized I couldn't hold back anymore. The teasing, the subtle touches, the lingering glances, it all built up into a weight that demanded acknowledgement. I stepped closer, careful not to crowd her, my hand brushing lightly against the corner of the textbook she was holding. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, but the effect was immediate. Her eyes widened slightly, a warmth creeping across her cheeks. Her lips parted ever so slightly, and for a moment, the classroom felt suspended in time. "I can't stop noticing you," I admitted, my voice quieter than I expected, almost swallowed by the soft light of the late afternoon. She blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing her features, and then a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her lips. It wasn't a smile of encouragement or flirtation, not yet, but one of acknowledgement, of recognition. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, as if granting permission for this unspoken exchange to exist. The air between us was heavy with something unspoken. Every slight movement, every subtle gesture became amplified. The brush of her fingers against a pen, the faint inhale as she shifted her weight, the warmth of her presence so close it made the hair on my arms rise, it all spoke louder than words ever could. Her gaze softened, and for the first time, I caught a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. She was allowing herself to be seen, if only in fragments, and it sent a thrill through me I couldn't quite control. There was a depth there, a quiet longing, that mirrored my own feelings, and the realization made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. We stood like that for several minutes, either of us moving, both aware of the fragile intimacy that hung between us. The playful teasing, the flirtatious banter, the subtle touches, it had all led to this moment of honesty. It wasn't a confession of love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something more profound, a mutual acknowledgement of curiosity, of desire, of the irresistible pull between two people who shouldn't yet be together but couldn't help being drawn closer. By the time I finally looked away, she was watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. But I knew one thing, the distance between us had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, and neither of us would ever be able to return to the ease of before. Something had begun, and we both knew it.by now, the tension between us had settled into something more profound, no longer just teasing or curiosity, but a quiet intimacy that was felt rather than spoken. It was late afternoon, the school nearly empty, the golden light of the sun spilling through tall windows and painting the classroom in warm, honey tones. Desks cast long, soft shadows, and the familiar smell of polished wood and faint chalk hung in the air. The world outside seemed distant, irrelevant, as if this little space existed only for the two of us. She was at her desk, reviewing a stack of papers, her posture relaxed yet still elegant, the kind of ease that only comes with confidence tempered by care. I approached slowly, my steps deliberate, my heart beating just a little too fast. She looked up as I neared, and there was that familiar spark, curiosity, amusement, something softer now, more vulnerable. I could see it in the way her eyes softened when she smiled, in the subtle tilt of her head as she listened to me. "I thought I'd help with these," I said, reaching for a paper, though my hand hovered just above it. Our fingers brushed lightly, accidentally or perhaps not, sending a warmth through me that was impossible to ignore. She caught my hand with hers for the briefest moment, a fleeting contact that lingered longer than it should, and I felt a subtle, electric thrill. We settled into a quiet rhythm, working side by side, our shoulders brushing occasionally. Every small movement carried meaning. When she leaned forward to read a note, her hair fell around her face, and I instinctively reached to tuck a stray strand behind her ear, the back of my hand grazing her cheek. Her eyes met mine, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. That fleeting touch, innocent yet intimate, held more weight than words ever could. We spoke softly, our conversation meandering from the lesson to more personal reflections. She shared small glimpses of her life outside the classroom, things she never said aloud to anyone else, and I listened, genuinely curious, feeling a connection that went deeper than attraction. It was trust, quiet and unspoken, growing in tandem with the subtle romantic tension. I found myself leaning slightly closer, drawn not just to her words, but to the warmth of her presence, the softness of her voice, the faint pulse of her wrist as she rested her hand near mine. At one point, our hands rested near each other on the desk. Neither moved, and yet, the closeness felt electric, intimate. It wasn't a bold, dramatic gesture. It was a shared acknowledgement of the bond forming between us. Her cheek lifted slightly as she tilted her head toward me in laughter at a small joke I made, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the lingering aroma of the classroom. It was overwhelming in the gentlest way. By the time we finally left the classroom, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the hallway. Our fingers brushed one last time, lingering, reluctant to separate. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic confessions, just a quiet, mutual understanding. The tension had softened into intimacy, and every glance, every touch, every shared silence spoke louder than words ever could. In that quiet closeness, I realized something. We were no longer merely drawn to each other. We had begun to truly see one another, the vulnerabilities, the curiosities, the quiet warmth that made our connection impossible to ignore. And in that shared understanding, there was something infinitely more. The end of the school year brought with it a bittersweet feeling, excitement for the summer ahead, but also a quiet ache at leaving behind the rhythms we had come to share. The classroom felt different now. Every corner, every desk, every faint echo of laughter carried memories of subtle glances, lingering touches, and moments of unspoken understanding. I walked in one final time, the sunlight streaming through the windows painting the room in golden warmth, and found her at her desk, calmly reviewing the last of the assignments. She looked up and smiled as I entered, and in that simple gesture, a flood of memories washed over me. The teasing challenges, the brushes of hands, the quiet moments of vulnerability, all of it had built into something delicate, profound, and undeniably ours. I felt a pulse of gratitude for the way we had allowed our connection to grow, careful and unhurried, yet undeniably deep. "I can't believe it's the last day," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, though it betrayed a hint of emotion. "Time flies," she replied, her eyes holding a softness that hadn't been there at the beginning of the year. There was no awkwardness, no tension, only the warmth of shared understanding. We lingered in the classroom a little longer than necessary, either of us ready to let go. I noticed how her fingers brushed over the edge of a textbook, almost unconsciously, and I reached out to steady it, our hands overlapping for a brief, deliberate moment. It was a small touch, yet it carried the weight of months of silent communication, of unspoken words and growing affection. When it was finally time to leave, we walked together toward the school's front doors. Outside, the sun was lowering into a soft amber glow, the long shadows stretching across the courtyard, the air warm and gentle. I could feel her presence beside me, steady and comforting, and there was a quiet magic in that shared silence. Our shoulders brushed occasionally, subtle and intimate, each contact sparking a faint thrill that neither of us tried to hide. As we reached the gates, she turned to me, and there was a hint of playfulness in her eyes, reminiscent of that very first day. "Impossible, weren't you?" she asked softly, her voice carrying both challenge and warmth. "Maybe not so impossible after all," I replied, a smile tugging at my lips. It was our private acknowledgement of the journey we had shared, the teasing, the curiosity, the tension, and now the quiet closeness. We paused for a final moment, and I found myself brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, a gentle, lingering gesture that conveyed more than words could. She rested her cheek lightly against my chest for a heartbeat, and I felt the calm steadiness of her presence, the warmth of her trust and affection. There was no need for dramatic declarations. This moment, simple and sincere, held everything we had been building toward. Finally, we parted, but not without a lingering glance that promised continuity. Our connection wasn't over, it had simply evolved into something stable, intimate, and lasting. The age difference, the boundaries, the propriety, none of it diminished the quiet joy and emotional fulfillment we had discovered. As I walked away, I felt a sense of completion. The slow burn, the teasing, the vulnerability, the intimacy, it had all led to this. A story that began with a whisper and a challenge had transformed into a bond neither of us could forget, one that promised a future of quiet closeness, respect, and affection. And that, I realized, was the kind of love worth waiting for. Worthful than passion, trust, comfort, and the promise of something lasting.